Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, former senior intelligence officer and author Carmen Medina on intelligence analysis, intuition, and precognition.
If Han Solo, when he says, I have a bad feeling about this, is correct 8 times out of 10, you want to pay attention to that. And we treat all these hard to quantify mental thinking, cognition qualities, we treat all of them with indifference. I believe that inevitably, if organizations study intuition, they will stumble onto people that appear to have some ability that we might call precognition. Analysis is writing great history in real time. You learn exactly why something happened. What were the causality loops? What were the odd little quirky personality moments that led to this happening rather than that?
Carmen, welcome to Chatter.
David, thanks for having me.
I think I mentioned this when I texted you about doing this. When Shane and I started this podcast, going back 3 years ago now, we quite consciously were designing it as something that wouldn't be looking just at the core issues of national security, but looking at what we thought of as the frontiers of national security. So where national security intersects with culture and arts and science and history and a bunch of things that weren't being covered in depth with interesting people. Our tagline was weekly long-form conversations with fascinating people at the creative edges of national security. And I had in mind you. Literally, I can show you the page we did where we started thinking of good guests to start with. And Carmen Medina was at the top of my list. And then I've just held on to it ever since. And I found that it's always been on my mind because you're a fascinating person who has been working at the creative edges of national security. You're peak chatter personally. So that puts a lot of pressure on you. This conversation will be our last with a guest because we are wrapping up Chatter after its 3-year run. And I wanted to have you as the final guest because of that initial feeling I had, but also because I knew any chat with you has always been personally enriching and informative for me. And I want to share that with others. So that's a long preamble, but it's my way of saying thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Very kind of you, David.
You would have ruined my plan if you would have said no for any reason. Yeah. But let's talk a little bit foundationally about your experiences inside intelligence and then beyond as a way to get to some core issues that I think we can really hit some interesting points about analysis, about intuition and creativity and even precognition. So let's start with your CIA career. You worked on several different analytic accounts as an analyst and as a manager in your first 10 years or so. Can you just walk through that so people geographically get a sense of the issues you looked at?
Right. I mean, I can't help but mention or note that thinking about national security primarily in geographic terms is an interesting bias in and of itself, right?
Absolutely.
But I ended up at CIA when I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. And even though as a college debater, that seemed to be where the momentum was taking me. And I was really interested in the world. And I started CIA as a graduate intern, which many people do. And I got hired into the Ops Center, which is the 24-hour, 24/7 watch office. And I got put on the Middle East Africa desk. And this is before, it's 1978, so it's well before the internet. And well before analysts had computers on their desks. And so the person manning the watch office was usually the first person to see some piece of cable traffic or some news bulletin. We had the ticker tape machines. the little ding, 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 some news alert was coming in.
But it's not just the wire services, right? You're also getting, human reporting
Of
cables,
course, no,
signal
we're
to
getting
intercept.
all the classified information,
Okay.
and it's coming first into this place. So I was working on Middle East and Africa. So I think we had a Soviet Union and Europe desk and probably an Asia and Latin America desk. Because as you know, because you had an agency career, oddly, Asia and Latin America kept getting paired up. We don't
Yeah.
know why, really.
And Africa kept getting passed around between
And
different
yeah,
offices
and,
over the
kind of
decades.
sent here, sent there. And
Yeah.
there's no sadder tale than where Sudan ended up because it would end up in Africa, it would end up in the Middle East, no one knew what to do with it. Anyway, because of that background, after about, 15 months in the Op Center, I end up getting pitched by the Africa division of the Directorate of Analysis to come work there. And so I did. And I worked, my first account was Botswana, Swaziland, and Lesotho. And soon I moved on to South Africa, which was a blessing because this was South Africa in the 1980s during the apartheid era. And it was like a fundamental issue where you really were having to analyze sort of the fundamental motivations of humans.
Yeah.
Their racism, their receptivity to change, their willingness to take risk, their willingness to engage in violence, right? Those are really primeval kind of things.
And it's a very different center and a very different focus point for analysis than counting tanks, right? Not, and I'm not diminishing that
Yes,
or being
exactly.
derogatory in
And
any
that's
way,
the point
but
I'm trying to make.
so different.
Yeah, it's so different. And so I did that for about 3 years or so. And then, typical bureaucratic, stupid stuff goes on. And, I don't know, I don't like my manager anymore. All this stupid stuff goes on. And the Middle East people come calling and they go, Carmen, we think you're smart. Why don't you come work for us instead? And it didn't strike me, and it clearly didn't strike them as odd that why would someone working on sub-Saharan Africa be fungible to go work on like Lebanon and the Palestinians? But off I went, and I ended up there working Lebanon the year everybody was killed. So the year the Marine barracks, before the Marine barracks, our embassy was attacked, bombed, and we lost one of the great legendary CIA case officers of all time, Bob Ames. And I did that for a couple of years. And I will say yet again that these issues, the kind of dynamics that were driving the Middle East at that time were sort of primeval, sort of fundamental. But there was more tank counting and stuff like that going on because they actually fought wars. And then I returned to sub-Saharan Africa, and I was asked to take on a project. So it's 1984.
Okay.
And so I started in 78, so I've covered about 6 years. And the people working on Africa, I think forever frustrated that Africa did not get the policymakers' attention, asked me and another analyst to write like a capstone paper on sub-Saharan Africa in the 1990s. So we were just being asked to look like 6 years ahead, really, maybe 10. Let's say our target was the midpoint.
Which, for context, is a long-term analytic product for an organization that's got a daily book going to the president.
Oh, yes, it was such an unusual project.
Yeah.
So we got 6 months to do it in, and we decided we needed to write 2 papers because South Africa was just such a dominant topic. So we did South Africa, and then we did the rest of Africa. And I remember at the time us trying to think of how could sub-Saharan Africa become important? Was there some rare mineral that was going to be found. At the time, the internet didn't exist, because now this idea of rare earth minerals is, we sort of had the idea, but we just, we didn't know where the future was taking us in terms of what would become important. And then the big thing that we got basically right was on the paper on South Africa, when we wrote that by 1990, the transition to black majority rule will be well underway, if not complete. That is my memory of the opening sentence, or the key judgment of that paper. Mm-hmm. And oh man, we had such a hell of a time getting it coordinated, because this was clearly a minority.
Describe coordination for people not familiar with the process there.
Well, one of the problems with collaboration is that we conflate collaboration with deconfliction. And so coordination means that you share your draft with everybody else who's working on that project, that legitimately you should be considering their perspective. So that would be all the other analysts working on South Africa. It might be your colleagues in the Directorate of Operations, probably not sharing it with anybody outside of CIA for no real good reason other than that it was just a CIA product. Mm-hmm. And back then, again, before the internet, coordinating on a real-time basis with other agencies was kind of almost impossible, right? When did you start?
Yeah, I started in the late 90s, and by then we did have connectivity, but even then,
yes,
we still had some of the legacies of non-coordination that technology allowed, but there were always excuses not to do it.
Right, exactly. And, there were no rules about coordination. Mm-hmm. I mean, there were rules about coordination when you were dealing with a product like an official national intelligence estimate.
Right.
And you had a coordinating body, the National Intelligence Officer, whose role was to kind of spread magic dust on the coordination process and reconcile the different views. Mm-hmm. But here it was mostly a courtesy. Mm-hmm. And
very personal, right?
And very personal.
I don't know if it was true in the time frame you're talking about, but some, 10 years later, it was very personal. It was, on this account that I'm working on, there is this woman at NSA, or, this guy at INR at State. And, we coordinated with them on almost everything because we just got it. We got each other. But that wasn't because there was some rule from on high saying you must coordinate with the senior analyst at INR.
Exactly. There were some people who legitimately you wanted to hear what they thought, because you knew they're going to have an interesting perspective. They're going to improve what I've done.
It made our thinking better.
But there were other people that you thought were less than useful. And you would play games. They would get the paper several days later, closer to the deadline, yada, yada. So
please provide comments on this 40-page paper by 30 minutes from now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that was what coordination was. So we had a heck of a time coordinating that judgment. Mm-hmm. I think it's fair to say that no other analysts working on South Africa,
they weren't there yet,
believed that. And I know the paper had some kind of disclaimer. This was back in the 80s when your names were actually, you had author credit.
Yep.
And I should say, so I'm very proud of that project. And I should go back to the Middle East thing and say another project that I'm very proud of is I wrote the first National Intelligence Daily feature. So it was like 10 paragraphs on Hezbollah. And I actually called the piece, "What is Hezbollah?" What is it?
Yeah.
And so we started to see this term, show up, referred to, and we just didn't know what it was. What is it? Is it, just we literally, is it just a term that people are using, like my lovely comrades, or is it actually an organization? What is it? And I think at the time Hezbollah didn't know what it was. It was in the process of becoming.
Okay.
So I wrote that. I wrote that.
I'm going to take
piece.
this opportunity to do
Yes.
something that is inherently unkind, but I'll ask your forgiveness. I'm going to put you on the spot to answer a question that's been on my mind for a long time.
Okay.
In most of the media and some parts of government adjacent work, think tanks and all that, Hezbollah is spelled with the Persian transliteration of Hezbollah. My experience that I recall, and maybe I'm wrong, but I seem to remember at CIA, and I think the official U.S. government name is spelled with the Arabic transliteration because it's taking part in, Lebanon primarily and originally, and it's Hezbollah. Are you the one who is actually responsible for doing the latter spelling in intelligence production?
I did the latter spelling in that piece.
Yes.
And I remember spending, you know how flawed our memories can be. But I actually remember a sentence or two in my feature trying to figure out if it was one word or party of God.
Right.
Grammatically, what was it?
Right.
And that actually is what contributed to the confusion as to what it was, because you would get it spelled in the traffic all sorts of different ways,
Right.
and you'd go,
Right.
party of God, do they mean that literally? What is that?
Yeah.
So kind of a fun analytic memory.
That was probably a good exercise to do. Do you know anything about the readership? Because my experience has often been that most busy policymakers will take time to read the one pager. And if it's anything longer than a one page, like if it's a long paper, first of all, it's a rare policymaker who will read it. And even the ones who want to might not get to it right away, but they usually will read the one page summary. So what feedback did you get, if any, on 10 long paragraphs?
I don't remember any feedback on that piece.
What a shame.
I remember being very proud of it. I had a lot of authorship pride. It was my idea to write it. I knew it had to be written. We had to start somewhere trying to figure out what it was, but I don't remember any feedback. I do remember feedback on that South Africa piece, which I was told by INR was sent, directly to George Shultz in his to be read folder. And that at least he read the key judgments and he said, that is correct. I believe this is correct. So that feedback I got, but I don't know whatever happened to my.
And this is before the era when it really was the mid and especially late 90s. And because you were a huge part of that effort, which we'll get to, about getting more feedback from policymakers, having more briefers, more interaction, publishing products when ready to meet them where they are, instead of forcing them into our 24-hour cycle and TikTok of the day. This is before that. So getting direct feedback from a Secretary of State was not as common as it would become later.
No, not it. I mean, it was so unusual.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, in addition to writing for the daily publications and then writing this long paper that I described, we also had like a magazine format called the Africa Review. And I think various geographic components had similar magazine kind of things. Yeah. And I remember someone once reporting that they saw somebody, obviously a policymaker, reading the Africa Review on the metro.
Oh, no.
That's what.
Wow.
And I was like, oh,
that's a different kind of feedback.
And I remember thinking on the feedback question, well, at least we know it was being read, and that's
you
good.
take the positive from it, right?
Yeah.
Do I recall correctly that not long after this that you did a tour in London?
I actually, after the Middle East, yes, after the Middle East, I returned to do that big paper on South Africa, and then I became the South Africa team chief.
How did you like management when you started? Because that's a different ballgame.
Yes, and it was tremendous fun, and we had incredibly talented people. And I just briefly, for like 6 months, was a deputy division chief on Central America. Ugh,
Oh,
what a horrible, horrible. I will never, I mean, after working on two fantastic, compelling sets of issues, to work on Central America,
it just didn't click
where
for you, huh?
basically you couldn't root for anybody. I
Mm,
mean,
yeah.
that sounds wrong, but we're
Yeah.
analysts are human beings, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're doing objective analysis, but you're still spending, 8, 9, 10, 12 hours a day soaking in this stuff, and you can't
Yes.
help but absorb something
Yes.
from that.
Something about this, right?
Yeah.
In Central America, and in both, well, definitely in South Africa, you could identify a solution space, right? Much less so in the Middle East.
Yeah.
No solution space.
Mm,
But even more hopeless in Central America
yeah.
seemed where people were fighting over literally nothing. I mean, none of those countries have enough economy to, it was just a mess. Well, anyway, then I get to go to London,
Got it.
and I spent 3 fantastic years there. And at that point, there I'm covering the entire world.
Right.
So the areas that I did the most on was the collapse of Yugoslavia, the first Iraq War, and the demise of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. So this is
So
late 80s into the early 90s.
yeah, I actually started in July of 1990 through July of 1993.
Okay.
So
Got it.
Tiananmen had already happened, and
Yeah.
what was left to
Yeah.
occur was the first Gulf War, the coup against Gorbachev, and the collapse of Yugoslavia.
But especially that first Gulf War, what a time to be in London because of the policy coordination at all levels, from heads of state down
Absolutely.
through the
Yeah.
bureaucracies, and you were organizing, coordinating, taking part in all of that in a no kidding shooting war.
Yes, I was at the kind of mid working level. So we had a senior rep, and I worked under Mike Barry, who of blessed memory, he just
Yeah.
passed, and John Allen, and who I think is still hopefully with us and healthy.
Yeah. It's a good team.
Yes, well, Mike and then John
Yeah.
replaced him. And the Gulf War began, I think, about 20 days. Well, Saddam invaded Kuwait about
Hmm.
20 days after I
Yeah.
arrived.
August. Sure.
So people always look at these tours in London at this is going to be great. You're going to get to live it up. It's a great reward for being a fantastic officer. And we basically pulled 6 12-hour shifts a week from that point until March, when the hostilities ended.
Yeah.
They finally sent an officer out to bulk us up maybe in the January, February timeframe. But I remember nobody got to travel, nobody got any leave. We were just constantly feeding information to the Brits.
Yeah.
At that time, the Brits had much more of a military than they do now. They sort of don't really have much of a military anymore. I mean, the functioning parts of the British military are not what they used to be. They know that.
Yeah.
But so they were, they had active role and significant roles. And I remember once my routine when shooting war, first the air war began. So I don't know. I'm trying to remember when the air war began.
I can't
I
remember
kind
the
of,
date.
I kind of think it went on for like 6 weeks or so before
Yes.
the
Yeah.
ground war began.
Right.
But at 6:15 or so, I would go to the cabinet office, when it was my turn, which is usually like twice a week. I'd go to the cabinet office to be part of their daily coordination session of their sit rep to their government, the prime minister, etc. And then at 7, I would just basically walk across the street to the Ministry of Defense and sit in at the 7 o'clock debrief for the Ministry of Defense. And whoever was there, and I'm not going to name him, but I still remember the story. They're talking about whatever target decks had been hit the overnight. And so the guy goes, such and such a place was hit, such and such a target in Basra was hit. And the person being briefed goes, well, who, which country hit them? Who were the aviators? And the briefer said, the French, sir. And the guy goes, that's hopeless. And then another thing, who was there? The Italians. Oh, the Italians, who have a tremendous reputation as aviators. Who knew, right? But they are quite well respected. So that amused me to no end. I mean, I just love that stuff.
Now this job though is different than your previous ones because you weren't creating analysis as a line officer, and you weren't a supervisor who is editing, empowering resources for analysts, editing products, things of that sort. You're doing a liaison function to help the two governments work together, right?
Right. And no, that's what made it such a fantastic job because I would, there was always an initial meeting on the draft. So the way for those of your listeners interested in the joint intelligence process, every week there's a meeting of the Five Eyes and a series of assessments on problems in the world are delivered. Well, before that final product is created, there are working level coordination sessions, and those are the ones that I would attend. And so it could be on almost anything, but never about Northern Ireland. No. And I loved it because I would read the draft. If we got it ahead of time, we would send it to Washington so that our analysts could comment. And then I would just sit at the table, offer suggestions, either because our analysts had suggested them or because I had, as an experienced officer, I had a point of view, or we can fix this paper by doing this. But then I would walk away and have no responsibility for doing any of the hard work. And I thought, this is like the most perfect job in the world. You
had the ideas and someone else could implement them.
Exactly. You could pontificate. You could be the smartest person in the room, or at least think you were, and walk away.
I think it says something really interesting about how the US-UK relationship had evolved decades before you got there to create that culture where US officer is sitting in on the JIC and sitting in on the Ministry of Defense meetings, offering analytic takes, being part of the process. And that was considered natural. It wasn't a weird thing.
But it wasn't just us. It was Five Eyes.
Right.
New Zealand was a little compromised then. So sometimes it would just be Four Eyes, but it would be New Zealand, Australia, Canada,
US.
Obviously the UK and the US. And I developed very good friendships with all of my Commonwealth, both professionally and in some cases personally, with my counterparts.
Yeah. I remember you saying that when you came back to headquarters from that job, you took one of the jobs you liked least in your career.
God,
you spent about 5 years working on the Was it called the Daily Economic Intelligence Brief at the
Well, I
time?
didn't spend 5 years doing on that. So
Okay.
basically, I did about, I don't know, 4 jobs in 18 months
Okay.
or 2 years, and none of them were any good. And,
Oh,
a classic problem for people then who served away from the mothership was that reentry was very difficult. And you might have been on a
you have a different
blazing
perspective.
trajectory
Yeah.
before you left, but when you got back, it
Right.
was like nobody remembered you.
You're right back in it. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I served as the CIA liaison to the Department of Transportation.
Hmm.
Why, you may ask? Because Lockerbie had happened, and
Oh,
in
the
the
the the
80s,
the
and the
explosion over
Department of
Scotland.
Transportation had
Right.
set up an intelligence unit.
Yeah.
I worked on, God, what was that called? Global Issues?
Okay.
Where they created a new national intelligence officer for global issues.
Hmm.
I mean, they were just beginning to recognize that not every issue of concern for national security conveniently broke down into a geographic
Right.
region of the world,
Certainly not by
right?
nation state borders and not even
Yes,
by region. So
exactly.
so you're talking truly transnational issues here, like
Transnational issues.
climate, pandemics,
Yeah, all those things.
international arms trade.
Although
Yeah.
perhaps climate had not yet been identified, but
Yeah.
we were deep into the AIDS crisis,
Yep.
so that had definitely been identified. Terrorism
Okay.
had been identified, but yes, those were was one unhappy job after another.
Yeah. Well, I know you did find a happy job, and what I think I remember working with you on was when you were put in charge of helping to revamp what had been the National Intelligence Daily, the NID. And by the end of the 90s, it was called the SEB, the Senior
Right,
Executives Intelligence Brief, if memory
right,
serves. And there were some issues related to it. We're trying to get it to more policymakers, trying to do it in a way that was useful to them, including electronically, which raised some security issues and related matters.
right,
And you were in the thick of it. And again, not doing core analytic work,
right.
but making sure that the analytic work that the many, many, many fine analysts and managers were doing was actually getting to where it needed to get to, because
Yeah,
analysis in a vacuum is useless.
right.
It has to be presented in a way policymakers can use. And you were at that part. Describe that job and what you really took away from that in terms of how communicating analysis to policymakers matters so much.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's interesting that you frame it that way. I mean, I think it's the correct framing, but it makes me wonder how exactly did that happen to me? Because I somehow when I get back from London and after a series of disappointing jobs, I end up becoming fascinated by technology. So I knew by 96, 97, I knew the internet was going to change everything for all knowledge organizations. And I just became an evangelical about that for the CIA. And this was a view, I mean, that was not only a minority view, but it was a despised view by most of the organization. They hated it. They hated the concept of the internet. And so I fell into that. And then I, and I'm not really sure how I fell into this, but I just became much more interested in how we think.
Hmm.
What is a good idea?
Yeah.
What is good analysis? How are we persuasive? What makes us persuasive?
Yeah.
And much less interested in any part of the world. So I just became well, not quite a methodologist, because I actually distrust reliance on methods.
Hmm.
I think that's like a false prop that
Yeah.
we
It can be a fallback and a crutch
we
to creative thinking, but we'll
like
talk
this
about that.
idea, this idea that thinking can be mechanical.
Right.
I find largely untrue. And so the thing that I was able to do first was to work on introducing these different ideas about how to do analysis, using the internet, how we didn't have to do newspaper format. I used to love to tell my great colleague, Peter Clemens, who loved newspapers. And this is, 2003. I'm telling Peter, newspapers are dying. They're soon going to be dead. And you need to stop. You need to move away from this concept. He hated it, right? Just, I was like the for not an insignificant number of people, I was the Antichrist on all these ideas.
Well, you were challenging, and it's obviously it's been a theme for you over the years, but you were challenging the orthodoxy not to be trouble, but to help the organization. And we'll get to later the book you wrote with Lois Kelly about this, not directly, but the themes that you lived by, called Rebels at Work, where you talked about wanting to improve things that aren't working and put the organizations at risk. You want to lower that risk. You want to make things work better by being kind of the person who speaks up, being the person who says,
and it's
we
just
need to talk about this.
Hard. It's so hard because most of us want to please, want to achieve, and at some point, you should be lucky if at some point in your career, your desire to keep climbing and succeeding, you question it because you don't believe it's no longer the right thing to do.
Right.
That there's something more right than you getting ahead.
It's like a revelation when that.
It is like a revelation, right? But it's a really difficult revelation, and you fight it. You keep thinking there's a way for me to advance these ideas without hurting my career, and that doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. It may happen to some really lucky people, but it doesn't happen.
Well, I know you can't talk about all the technology stuff, but in a nutshell, what changed from the mid-90s to the early 2000s in terms of using technology, not really in analysis so much, but in terms of communicating it to policymakers? How did you shift that system?
So we had this, so what I was trying to do was use digital technology, which was really in its infancy then, in the year 2000, but to use digital technology to break out of the once in the morning newspaper and to deliver our analysis as soon as it was ready to the people that needed to receive it. And at that point, and this is still the case today, at that point, most policymakers did not have the ability to receive secret information at their desk.
Yep.
But we did have, and we were growing out a series of rep jobs. We would have a rep at Commerce, we would have a rep at DOD, we would have reps at the NSC, and these people did have secure terminals. And so all we were trying to do was push out, as soon as it was ready, the information that they needed, and then they could then, in a bespoke kind of way, provide it to the policymakers.
Right.
And this wasn't that hard to do, but it just seemed, again, now I can't imagine, anyone who's below the age of 40 is going to think this sounds ridiculous. But people just thought that analysis should only be done once a day as a result of a authoritative, carefully reviewed process. And I was like, well, maybe speed is more important than 100% accuracy. And of course, the events of 9/11 really brought that home.
Yeah.
But it is, for me, as we talk about this, it's like I don't really even understand anymore why this was so controversial, and yet it was.
Yeah. Yeah. But it did change the culture. That is, the benefits of doing it became so clear that, I mean, I certainly recall within years, it was just the normal course of business. And it was aided by non-technology in some ways. It was aided by having a physical person
Yes, of
who could
course.
be a liaison to not just one CIA rep to the State Department, but reps to different
Right,
bureaus
right,
or reps to different parts of the National Security Council staff, so that it also was a human endeavor of creating the relationships, gaining the trust, learning what they needed and when they needed it, which analysts in cubes in the 1950s and 60s, they were guessing what policymakers wanted because there
exactly.
was more of an institutional
Right,
bias against direct communication with
right,
policymakers at the
right,
working level. By the early 2000s, you had a lot of interaction going on
right,
so that
exactly.
people knew.
Yeah, and then, I remember people making arguments like, well, if you let the briefer show the piece to the Secretary of Commerce, who knows what the briefer will say? We're not in control of
Yeah.
that process. And
Yeah.
and my reaction was, get over it. You were never in control of the process the way you
Yeah.
thought you were. So just get over it.
Yeah. So you end up on the seventh floor. I think you did the the SAG group for, well, first
Yeah,
talk through that.
strategic
Talk,
assessments group. Yeah.
yeah, talk through strategic assessments and how, at least at that time, that was seen as distinct from other work.
I think that's probably what really started my serious thinking about what is good analysis. And I
Hmm.
remember going in there, and their job was to scan the horizon and really look many years ahead to try to identify what were the emerging issues that were going to affect
Hmm.
national security. And I remember asking the analysts, and they were all, I think there was one woman, maybe two. I remember they were all guys. And why is that important? They were, okay, I'm going to say things that people will happily be able to criticize, but there was like this thing about strategy and playing war games and playing diplomacy that seemed to attract men, masculine energy more than it attracted feminine energy. Why is that? Do you have a theory, David? I'm not exactly sure.
My only suspicion, because now in more recent times I see much more balance on all sides of that in terms of who likes the wargaming and plays the games, and also on the strategic and different types of thinking. I think that's, I don't know if improved is the right word, but it's changed.
Right.
I think where that came from back then is generally in at least the culture and the milieu I was in growing up, I could play Dungeons and Dragons. I could play Risk. I could
Yeah.
play war games about World War II, a little desktop game. None of the girls I knew did that.
Yes, I know they
Culturally, the
didn't.
attitude was that's kind of a boy thing to do, and that kind of creates, if not a path dependency, at least
Yes,
a trend
exactly.
line that then affects the workplace.
Right, right. So anyway, all these guys. So I remember asking them. And since I'm really into the internet and really on top of it, more so than most of my colleagues, I was aware of things like the blogosphere, and that all sorts of people were posting really interesting perspectives on what was
Hmm.
going on in the world and what was important, and that if you really wanted to be on the cutting edge of thinking, reading the New York Times every day and foreign affairs every month was not going to cut it. And so I asked him, well, tell me what your process is for identifying emerging issues. And they had nothing good to say. They
Hmm.
just had nothing good to say. And so I spent 18 months I was there just really trying to totally shake their world up and make them do different kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
I emphasize graphics a lot more, pictures. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff we can say about what our reliance on words does to our thinking.
Hmm. Hmm.
during this recent election cycle, the Trump did not win because of the elegance and logic of his speeches. There's something else going on that we ignore at our own peril.
I think we saw that in the intel business, on the dissemination side. I certainly saw it when I was a briefer. We briefed a lot of people who were disproportionately lawyers or people who did things with words and logic and all that. So
Right.
you already have a crowd that is biased towards wanting that kind of presentation of analysis. And yet, even in that crowd, when you had a compelling visual, when you had
Yes.
something that could show the evolution or the growth or the variables, something having to do with a world situation, and it was hitting a different part of their brain, you could actually see the excitement in some cases, but you could hear the questions that came out. You could see the physical reaction to, wait a minute, I don't have to read the 900th document that I'm going to read today. I'm actually
Right.
looking at this and it's conveying meaning to me. Now that takes some graphic designers who are really freaking good at their jobs to take complicated ideas and express them visually. But we had those people, and some of those products were our best products.
Exactly. Right. So anyway, for me, working with the strategic assessments group made me fundamentally question a lot of our assumptions about what is good analysis.
Yeah.
You
And you
know,
got to take those lessons to a leadership role in the Directorate of Analysis. I think it
yes.
still was at the time. It's been renamed and shuffled and
Yeah,
things,
yeah, yeah.
but Directorate of Intelligence, Directorate of Analysis, same thing.
Yeah.
Now you were unusual in that role for a couple of reasons,
That's what people say. But,
right?
it's hard for me to judge because I'm just me.
I'm going to say it. It was. You look at the history of people who are running the Directorate of Analysis on the seventh floor. Not exclusively, because once in a while there will be a Gates, but usually it's somebody who has progressed through each layer of management, maybe with a policy rotation or an overseas assignment, but they've gone through 3-4 layers of management to grow into the strategic leadership role. You bounced a bit more than the average person on that track. You also happen to be a Puerto Rican woman, and you brought change just in terms of what you represented, whether you wanted to do that or not. That did happen. People recognized that there was change. Most importantly, though, by far the most important was you brought a sense of creativity, of challenging the system from within into the leadership itself, which is mind-blowing for most bureaucracies and probably hair-pulling frustration for you in some sense, having to deal with that. So talk about that experience. What is it like to lead an analytic directorate that is so focused on, producing the products, following tradecraft, doing things so that we can't be wrong, and suddenly you're in there trying to, in a sense, challenge the model of how people think and produce intelligence?
Well, that's such a hard question to answer in an economic way. I was always conscious of wanting to push, but not get ahead of whatever I perceive to be the consensus, of what the system would tolerate. I think I was very lucky that I came on during a period of rapid growth after 9/11, where we hired,
Yeah.
boatloads of analysts. And those new analysts were very sympathetic toward my energy. That's, they wanted, this is the analytic directorate that they wanted to be part of. I was, I was very committed to making sure that the new analysts had a voice. I was so committed to that. And right around that time, 2004, the blogging technologies come into the agency. And so I decided to model a personal, but at the same time, professional blog. So I started blogging 2 or 3 times a week. And as a result, well, not just of me, because there were other people that were trying to create this sort of continuous exchange on analytic issues. This brings us all the way back to coordination, where we began the conversation. And as a result, I believe that the blogging environment still exists in the intelligence community. And I think I was a real contributor to that. And I also said yes to Intellipedia. I had these 2 guys come to me and say, hey, we need to bring in the media wiki software and create our own classified Intellipedia. And I said, that just sounds like the best idea ever. Let's do it, But I said, but we have to do it surreptitiously at the start. We have to not draw too much attention to ourselves, because those were the days when people were arguing that, Wikipedia was a bad idea and was going to corrupt Western civilization, when you think back on those arguments, they're just so ridiculous.
And especially because a few years after that, I can't remember the source of this, I apologize, but someone did a limited study of Wikipedia and looked at a certain number of entries in Wikipedia compared to, and I want to say it was the Encyclopedia Britannica,
Right.
but it was something that was curated. The entries
Yes.
were written by experts, and they found that essentially the error rate between the two was roughly the same, which
Yeah, exactly.
says a lot.
So I think, what did I do well? I think I emphasized giving other people their voice as much as I possibly could. I spent a lot of time talking to the Kent School and trying to explain sort of how I saw analysis. I remember using the phrase all the time, we have to unpack our analysis. All the time I would say, we can't. I remember once Donald Rumsfeld criticized us for speaking with an inappropriate air of authority. He was talking about CIA analysts.
Yeah.
98 out of 100 people who heard that just got angry. How dare he say that? And I remember thinking, that's a really interesting point, right?
Right. It's a real observation. And it's a real observation.
Yeah,
and
it's a real
you can decide to get
observation.
angry about it, or you can think about where it comes from and
Yes,
what's worth
and
reflecting
then I
on.
said, we sometimes don't really explain. We just assert things without truly explaining or making transparent our logic. And so I was a big advocate of that.
Yeah, showing our work.
Show our work, exactly.
Yeah. That does. I want to set up for some discussion that we'll have a little bit later about intuition.
Right.
And that there is a double-edged sword there, right? If you're unpacking your analysis and you're getting policymakers used to seeing the logical progression, right? We have fact X, fact Y, fact Z. If you connect X and Y causally, I'm showing my work of logic and argumentation and evidence to back up this product. Well, that's starting to look like a mathematical proof, right? It's not
Exactly.
It's got caveats, it's got uncertainties, it's intelligence. We're not talking about the known, we're talking about what isn't knowable or known in full. But it does create this mindset that analysis has to be rigorous to be useful, when in fact, sometimes if you're trying to increase understanding,
Right.
you're not trying to prove something, but you're trying to help policymakers understand the scope of a problem.
Right.
Sometimes the analytic rigor isn't the most important part.
No, it's not. And, there's just so many issues there. By quantifying or documenting using language all of the points that lead up to our conclusion, some factors or variables lend themselves to more documentation than others. So how people are feeling is way harder to document than the number of tanks that are on the ground. And yet, if a particular situation is going to blow up, this sort of intangible thing of how people are feeling is really critical to that. And so that was a tension, because I thought we needed to unpack our work, but we also needed to avoid only caring about the things that we could document and measure, because that was limiting. So back then, a lot of people would talk about structured analytic techniques.
Yes.
I grew to dislike that phrase. And I would often say, my favorite structured analytic technique is taking a walk with one of my favorite thought partners and talk about the issue. We actually know from research that our brains evolved to work well while we're in motion. That's what we were, savanna hunters.
Yeah.
And so this idea that we have to sit in a cubicle and write, and that's what will lead to a good analysis, is inherently a flawed idea.
Yeah.
But like all bureaucracies, bureaucracies are into execution. And so they always will favor that which they can execute consistently. So the things that are harder to do, the creation of great art, the revelation of a really fantastic insight, bureaucracies will always avoid that because they can't easily do them.
Yep.
And that's where all your problems develop.
Yeah. So I think I know the answer to this, but did you find it frustrating that even at the time you were there in the leadership position, there were those around you, and some of those in subordinate management positions who later would take on senior roles, who had the mentality of, we can just keep pushing the analysts harder and harder to get the tradecraft better and better, and we will beat better analysis out of them by being so rigorous with 8 layers of review of the analysis so that
it's
it is
ridiculous.
precise and perfect, but frankly, sometimes lacking insight as a result.
It's just, I remember some of my experiences as the PDB senior reviewer. So usually I would do that twice a week.
And just mention what that entails. So the PDB has been
President's Daily
produced,
Brief,
written,
which
edited.
is the platinum product of the Directorate, now the DNI, but it was the few pages of content that would be delivered to the president every morning by the presidential briefer. And so there would, it varies depending upon the president, but there might be anywhere from 5 to 10 pieces of content. And you have to have a very senior person be the last reviewer. Frankly, because we never figured out how to do quality control at scale. We just, isn't that kind of a funny thing to say? Because that was the problem. We were constantly working, but we never figured it out.
Yeah.
So the ultimate quality depended upon the biases, preferences of the senior reviewer that night. So, and I remember, there's nothing more dreadful, nothing more frightening than being there at 11:30 p.m., waiting for the last piece to emerge from the editorial process. And the last piece might be about, Al-Qaeda or Pakistan, or Putin. It's a really important piece.
Yeah.
And the piece finally arrives at your desk, and it's a piece of shit. It's incoherent. You don't know what the heck. You have no idea. You don't know how this happened. You don't have the time to figure it out. The analysts were always told to stay until your piece is done, particularly a very important piece.
Yeah.
And I remember on more than one occasion bringing the analyst into my office. Sometimes they were just so frightened. You could tell. And I said, look, this isn't working. I don't really know what you want to say. So let's just put it aside. Let's take out a piece of paper. This is the question. Tell me what you want to say.
Yeah.
And we would have maybe 30 minutes. And I'd say, okay, type it up. Let's go. Now, is that how the process is supposed to work?
You've just taken multiple layers of review and thrown them out the window.
I know,
right?
but my experience is those multiple layers of review did not fix.
Yep.
And probably did not start with asking the analyst, okay, what does the president need to know about this topic?
Yep.
Tell me the 3 things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why is that so broken? I mean, is it still broken? I imagine
know.
it still is broken.
I'm going to guess that at least some of the time, Carmen, you did that. And what the analyst told you, when she walked through the topic out loud and you wrote it down, probably some of the time they would tell you, sometimes they wouldn't. But that's probably closer to the original draft they had, right? Before the layers of review, which of course raises that question, well, is there a role for, more straight line publishing to policymakers? You lose accountability as an organization to some degree. You lose a little bit of control, whatever that means. But you do get better insights from some analysts. And the hard part is it's not true of everyone. You sometimes need those layers to catch certain things from people who don't communicate the insights well. So I don't know of a system that can capture both perfectly.
Yeah, no, I was a big proponent that we needed to figure out a way to provide our insights less formally.
Mm-hmm.
We don't less formal, less hierarchical, but still authoritative. Not exactly sure if that's the formula I use, but I was trying to create a distinction that we can be authoritative without hierarchy and without formality.
Now, we got to some of that during your time on the 7th floor when President Bush, this is Bush Jr., it's 43, when he was starting to bring in deep dive briefers.
It's clearly that's what he was craving.
Yeah. Real discussions with senior analysts, which, yes, were guided by coordinated views. But if the President of the United States asks you for your insights on a related topic and you are the person who is expert on that, you're not going to go back and coordinate it with a team. You're going to answer the president. Yeah. And he seemed to get a lot out of that, according to him. He told me, all of his advisors said.
Everybody said that was
briefing
fantastic.
process was golden for them.
Yeah. So I don't know. There's just something about the institutionalization of analysis and insight that just has never worked.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people that like to control processes keep wanting to believe that you can make that perfect. My experience is no, you can't.
And even if you can make it closer to perfect, and I don't think, I know there have been studies, maybe you were in charge of some of these at one point, to try to get at this. I think methodologically it's almost impossible to, but let's say you know what the perfect analytic piece would be. And you look at each layer of review and you go back and compare it to all others. You might find, I'll at least say it's possible, you might find that the average piece from this particular office is at 60% of where it should be when the analyst first writes it and gets it through coordination. Then after the team chief, the first layer looks at it, it gets it to 75%. And then the next layer of management reviews it, and typically it gets it to 85%. And then the next 3 layers get it, to 88, and then they get it to 90, and then they get it to 91. That logic can push you both directions. That logic can push you where some people went, well, we need 9 layers of review because we got to get it to 100 or at least 99. Or it can be, what's wrong with you? You're spending hours and hours and the taxpayer resources going to all of these people looking at the same 3 paragraphs all day long is only getting you from, say, 85% after a couple of layers to 95%. What are we doing here?
Right.
There's no quick answer to that, but that assumes that you can measure something in terms of what is the platonic ideal of a finished
Yes,
intelligence
right.
product, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure we ever got there.
No, and one of the ways I like to describe what is analysis, one of the formulations I would use is analysis is writing great history in real time. If you look at great histories, often written decades, if not centuries after the event, you learn exactly why something happened. What were the causality loops? What were the odd little quirky personality moments that led to this happening rather than that? Ideally, that's what you want. That is what great analysis is writing great history
Yeah.
in real time. That is rarely achieved.
It's rare, but I saw it. When I was briefing the PDB, there were days, I mean, there were many days when I would open up the book, look at the drafts of the pieces I would be briefing once they got printed, and I would shake my head and say, this is the best we can do, right?
Yes.
But there were probably just as many days where one of the pieces in the book, I would read it and I would say, oh, that's why we do this. Like this is
Yes.
why we invest billions
Right.
of dollars as a country in this,
Right.
because this is delivering insight to the president
Exactly.
in an actionable way on a topic that needs addressing. And I'm not going to say it totally made up for the feeling of
Yeah.
the first batch, but it did. It in many ways, it said, okay, you're going to have some of those. You're going to have some where it's a status report, where it's kind of a gisting of what's known and doesn't really deliver impactful insight. But the experience of doing that and working those muscles can get you to jump that high bar once in a while.
Right, yes. And that's a tricky part because a lot of what analysis or intelligence does can seem really rather mundane. And it is in fact a form of practice
Yeah.
to try to get better and better until you can more reliably deliver stuff that is not ordinary.
We hinted earlier, Carmen, and I want to make it more explicit now, at this tension between, very systematic, rigorous, analytic thinking that is presented almost like a legal brief compared to intuition and the role of intuition in the analytic process, and how can you have a rigorous tradecraft that eliminates or reduces many pathological biases to good analysis while still keeping the intuitive spark. You've thought about this and written some of it. I would love for you to write even more, but you've thought about this more than anyone else I know for many years. How do you start thinking through that issue of capturing intuition without losing some of what decades have taught us leads to good analysis with logic and argumentation as well?
Daniel Kahneman wrote a great book close to 15 years ago now,
Is this Thinking Fast and Slow? Yeah.
And the book, for me, had a tremendous impact because for the first time, he described something that when I read it, I intuitively knew that was true, that we have like these heuristic things that allow us to do things very quickly. And then sometimes we have the time and luxury and the necessity to break it down and really understand it. Now I've come to learn that the book was mistaken in a way, and I think he admitted it, in that, or it was misunderstood in that our intuition, which is our system one, our immediate way our brain reacts to something, that our intuition is inferior to our analytic thinking habits. If anything, the reverse is true. But I think the healthier way to think about it is that both are important and both contribute. I've had any number of moments in my analytic career when I had an insight that I could not explain at the time how I had it, or even why I thought it was important, and yet it proved to be important. So when I was working on South Africa, I remember the whole thing was, will the whites ever compromise? Will the blacks ever be able to bring effective pressure to bear? And I remember a garbage worker strike in a town that was called at the time Port Elizabeth. Has a different name now. And the strike got so horrible that the white city government finally sat down to negotiate with the black and colored, those are their terms, garbage workers, to negotiate an end to the strike. And I remember when I read that, unlike all my other colleagues, when I read that, I went, this is very significant.
Mm-hmm.
And I would try to tell them, this is very significant. And they would go, why? It doesn't mean anything. They got a couple of concessions. Who cares? I struggled to tell them why it was significant. I couldn't articulate it, but I knew my little brain was tickling and going, this matters.
Mm-hmm.
In retrospect, now I can articulate what I was noticing. My intuition was noticing, oh, if these white people are willing to sit down with blacks to negotiate about this, when they've never been willing to sit down with blacks to negotiate about anything, maybe the sky's the limit. Maybe this is the thing that will break through the barrier.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of physics. I mean this literally involved in this. So for example, the idea from complexity theory that change is not linear, but in fact, change tends to go through steps.
Yeah.
Sideways up, sideways down, then up, And we tended to assume, and analytic thinking tends to assume a nice, clean, linear thing. We love those 2x2 quadrants that we use in analysis. And one of my pet peeves about these 2x2 quadrants is who says the four squares are even in size?
Right. Yeah.
Who says the lines are straight? I mean, why aren't they diagonal or curvy, right?
Yeah.
So you have to be open. You have to listen. When a thought enters your mind, you have to ask yourself, why did it come in? And how did it get there? And did my intuitive, much more powerful part of my brain make connections that I myself am not yet able to articulate? But it's annoying. It refuses to be ignored, right?
Let me push you on that. You just said, and I agree with so much of what you say there, but you just said, when you have the thought, you have to know where it comes from and how you got there. And I want to push back on it a little bit and say, maybe, right? It's certainly nice. It satisfies my intellectual curiosity to know why, when I'm trying to write something and I'm struggling, all of a sudden I get this idea, this analogy, and it actually makes it work. I'm curious about how I got there, but I'm not sure I need to know if I got there, if it actually does create insight, if it generates a way of telling the story or moving my thinking forward. I could spend the rest of my life self-reflecting and maybe not figure out how that intuition came about. So is there value to doing that? Perhaps maybe it hones your intuition skills. It makes you more open to doing it if you understand there's a cause. I get that. But that sounds like you would say you might reject some insights that come from intuition that you can't find the origin of.
No, I think that's a fair point, and I did not intend to express myself that way. Right. So what I mean is, when a thought enters your mind, you need to pay attention to it
and capture it, right? Don't let it float away.
And go, this thought entered my mind. And we all have experiences where a thought enters my mind and we don't actually know where the heck it came from.
Yeah.
And it's your brain, which is a much more powerful pattern recognition device than anything that has been created by an artificial intelligence lab. Still, your brain connects ideas without you physically having those rational thoughts.
Yeah.
And your analytic process has to honor that mental activity because it can be very powerful.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be misleading, but so can
So can type your thinking,
mechanistic
right?
analytic thinking be misleading.
Yeah. You've written somewhat about this. A couple of years ago in the Cipher Brief, you wrote an article about the potential of integrating intelligence
Right.
and intuition. And it's funny, when I first saw the article, my reaction was about the title, which is, might not even be your title, but I always thought intelligence incorporated into it. I never had the idea that intelligence was in opposition to intuition, that we had to integrate the two. I always thought that it was an never-ending struggle between I need to find the sources, I need to line them up, I have to tell a coherent story so that we can defend to the policymaker why we added up X, Y, and Z and got to this conclusion. But at the same time, delivering some insight, which doesn't always come from that process. And maybe it was because I was gifted with amazing managers and colleagues that I worked with that more often than not wanted creativity, wanted to find that new way of seeing something. But it occurred to me intelligence was in part about intuition, but you wrote about it and really pointed out the main issue, which is how is it that we actually create an analytic tradecraft and structure to make sure we don't lose that?
Right, exactly. And what was so interesting about that article is I wrote it because I had an ulterior motive. I really wanted to write about precognition. But I thought I'd be laughed out of the room if I kind of led with that. So I thought I sort of used intuition as a way to enter the discussion about the potential for precognition.
Right.
And
Right.
much to my surprise, I got a lot of negative comments about intuition. I got all sorts of, on LinkedIn and other places, people arguing with me about how, basically devaluing the potential of intuition in the analytic process. And so the points I made about precognition were totally ignored. And the point that I was making was that if you actually create a serious intent to capture your intuitions, one of the things that will likely happen is that you will recognize people who have more interesting, vibrant, reliable intuitions than others. I mean, these people become the great artists in our culture, right? Yeah. Right? Yeah. And I remember talking to somebody at NASA about this, and they were very receptive to this idea that if you're like on Mars, you would like to know, you've got 10 people on your Mars team, which of these 10 people reliably has more interesting intuitions? Like Han Solo, I have a bad feeling about this. If Han Solo, when he says, I have a bad feeling about this, is correct 8 times out of 10, you want to pay attention to that. And we treat all these hard to quantify mental thinking, cognition qualities, we treat all of them with indifference.
Right.
If we don't study them, we don't figure out, okay, under what circumstances is intuition heightened? Who's better at it? Who's worse at it? And I think, I believe that inevitably, if organizations study intuition, they will stumble onto people that appear to have some super intuitive ability that we might call precognition.
Okay, I do want to break that down, the intuition and precognition thing, but I want to ask something first. Why don't we train on that in intelligence? Because there is research being done on that. There are psychologists, there are organizational people who are looking at intuition and the interplay of intuitive and organizational constructs. That the research is out there, but it maybe my history parallels yours, which is I found that when I left the agency, It surprised me how insular we were as an organization and how rarely we incorporated insights from relevant tangential research.
That's correct.
And why is that? Because as a learning organization, and it is a learning organization, you mentioned the Kent School, the Training Academy for Analysts, which does a remarkable amount of work on really trying to incorporate new ideas and introduce people to different ways of thinking, different ways of expressing analysis. That is the organization, and yet for some reason, institutionally, it's hard to bring in new cutting-edge research at the frontiers of technology.
Yes, whatever social science literacy you have when you join the agency is pretty much the social science literacy you'll end up using your entire career. Why is that? I think everything in academia, like to get a PhD or a master's, is based on studying already published material,
The existing literature, yeah.
the existing literature, and riffing off of that, perhaps arguing persuasively against it, but with your own evidence,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And in the intelligence business, the existing academic literature is the intelligence. And so one of my great insights, I feel personal insights, is that we treat the intelligence that we get, those reports, as if they accurately represent reality, when we actually do not know the delta between the reports that we get and reality. In other words, the gap. And the gap, in my opinion, is humongous. And when I was working with the analysts, I would ask them, imagine that this room represents everything that an omniscient God would know about Al Qaeda. All available information. What article in this room represents what we actually know? Well, one, they'd never been asked that question before. And then they would say things like the coffee cup I'm holding.
Out of the entire room.
Out of the entire room. Or maybe they'd say, well, the back wall.
Yeah.
But what they always said something very small. And yet we have no way of quantifying the information that we have in terms of how accurately it represents reality.
Right.
And so we reduced our tradecraft simply to accurately studying that bit of reality that we can observe and extracting whatever insight is available from that. And so because of that, we constantly have intelligence failures.
Right. Okay. So with all this in mind, I want to try to separate out a little bit the intuition and the precognition, because I think of them differently, and I want you to explain to me the linkage in a way that I can better understand. So when I read your article, I was not hung up on the intuition part. I was with you. I think that intuition is an example of advanced thinking, and we just don't know how we got there, but it's based on experiences, it's based on information, it's based on connections and linkages that just I might not be able to write it out, but I just have a feeling that this is going to lead to this. But that feeling could come from the fast thinking, right? I get that. Opening up to more of that, I think, I'm sure there are some arguments against it, just in terms of error rates until people get a grasp on their own intuition. And when it's just creative fantasy, I get that. But I think we can get there. Precognition to me is different, because when you talk about precognition, you're not talking about somebody who is operating at the speed of a computer. It's not in the Isaac Asimov Foundation series, the discipline of psychohistory, where mathematics were so evolved that you could figure out across generations what human groups were going to do based on certain social and economic inputs. That's like supercomputer. That's the weather computer taking into account every bit of data to predict exactly what it's going to be doing on my street at 4 p.m. tomorrow. That's still the thinking stuff. That's not getting a message from the future.
Right.
which is not about thinking. It's not about analysis. It's an input that is outside the analytic process. And I define that different than intuition. So help me understand how the two are linked in a way that doesn't lead people just to reject precognition. Because frankly, I didn't. I read your article and I fell prey to the bias of looking at the communicator. Because honestly, if I would have read that from some people, I probably would not have ever thought about it again. But I've talked to you enough and heard enough creative ideas from you over the years that I said, I've got to take this seriously. But I still don't get how the intuition to precognition link works that way.
Well, I think I'm not sure that it is a link, but as I understand the work that is being done on precognition, I think it kind of is, it depends upon physics. So there are various theories about what consciousness is, and I'm not going to be able to represent them all. But one view is, and what consciousness is a hotly debated topic in physics, in metaphilosophical circles. There's one view that consciousness is just basically an artifact of our physiology. You know, it's like Descartes, I think, therefore I am, kind of thing. So that's one view. And then another view is that the universe exists because of consciousness, that consciousness is actually what creates the universe. I don't understand it any more clearly than that, so I can't explain it any more clearly than that. But if consciousness exists outside of us, so that consciousness is like a force in the universe in the same way that gravity is a force in the universe, then the second thing you believe or you posit is that consciousness is not governed by time. And then if you accept that point of view, then an idea from the future can leak into the present.
So yeah, if you relax some assumptions based on the way that we operate in linear time, the way that we perceive
Exactly.
reality,
Yes.
if you relax those assumptions, yeah, you could talk about
And
a
there's a
circle
great
effect.
book which I read called American Cosmic.
Okay.
It's a fantastic book where
Yeah.
she was looking at at UFOs, but then she eventually, which of course is very topical right now, and then she started talking to like many scientists, including Nobel Prize winners, many of whom remained anonymous in the book, but she's now written her second book where they are named. I think one of them is Gary Nolan from Stanford.
Okay.
Anyway, when they talk about their idea process, when a thought enters their mind, when a moment of insight occurs, they often say, I feel like it's the future speaking to me. Many Nobel Prize winning physicists or in other scientific fields will often say, the idea came to me in a dream. And this is, I think, where the line between intuition and precognition starts to get a little fuzzy. Because was it really just your mind working in the background, creating connections, and then presenting it to you at the opportune moment? Or was it some idea from the universal consciousness leaking into your head?
Everything you described, right? It coming to me in a dream, or I feel like it's from the future. It's not diagnostic. That could be described by a fast thinking process.
Exactly.
Or
Exactly.
it could be from another cause that we don't
Right.
have firm evidence for yet. But your point isn't, you're not declaring something is or isn't. You're saying we need to explore this if it's a way of getting better intuition.
Exactly. My point is that if indeed precognition is a reality for whatever reason, probably the likeliest way that we will observe it is by learning as much as we possibly can about intuition. So,
Right.
in the process of
Right.
really understanding intuition, attempting to replicate it, understanding the circumstances under which it appears
Yeah.
more often than not, by doing all of those things, we will also be capturing information, if precognition is real,
Right.
about precognition.
And at the same time, by studying intuition more extensively, you might actually disprove precognition. You might find, no, we've
You
found
might,
the pathway
exactly.
for it,
You might find that
right?
it is
So you have to have researchers open
all
on both sides.
it's all
Yeah. Yeah.
a function of incredibly sophisticated cognitive abilities.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we all
Yeah.
know that there are things that exist in reality that we cannot physically observe. Parts of the light spectrum, the way dogs can hear sounds that we can't hear. We all know that this is all physically accepted fact,
Yeah.
right? And there just might be ways that ideas manifest themselves that we cannot observe,
Yeah.
nor can we measure them.
I think a big push for all of this, from some of the best science fiction writers of the last 50 years to no kidding scientists like Julia Mossbridge, who you've done some presentations with, a lot of this comes from the mind altering experience of this thing called quantum physics, which
Right,
is almost inherently ununderstandable,
right,
but yet it's solid scientific practice. Finding, yep, there's stuff happening that we just can't get our heads around because it does not comport with our reality.
right,
That should open us up to researching a lot of things that just seem, for lack of a better word, a little crazy according to our way of looking at things.
right, right,
Unfortunately, I find it also, people will just throw the word quantum on something and say it explains it. Well, why is it that this is happening? Oh, well, it's quantum agriculture, or it's quantum epidemiology, or
right,
and they use it as a shorthand for what they don't understand, and as a way of making something that is, in some cases, conspiracy theory,
yes,
muddled thinking. They try to give legitimacy to it by saying, well, this thing could be happening because, well, quantum. And that's a real danger, because how can you explore something that is inherently at odds with our everyday lived experience in terms of linear time?
right,
How can you seriously study that, honoring the possibility without falling prey to the very human tendency of falling in love with what you work and wanting to find a solution that
right,
you now believe in at a level beyond the scientific method that has served our species very well in the most important ways of life?
right.
That's a really tough one to get right.
Yeah, I mean, humans are like explanation-seeking animals. And, I'm not as well read in the theory of human cognition as I could be. But the fact that we are driven to expect causality all the time is what, for example, inspires our religious beliefs. Yep.
Yeah.
We're just not inclined to accept that this is all there is. There's got to be a reason why. And so humans, when no other explanation is apparent, that's when they'll just create conspiracy theories,
Yeah.
because they just cannot they cannot abide causality vacuums. So you mentioned Julia, and one of the things that we've been collaborating with just in the last few weeks is trying to get public support for, an effort to explore edge science. So, trying to understand what intuition and precognition is an edge scientific activity. So we have a petition out on change.org. A couple of other people are supporting it. And we're just trying to get people, that it would be a good thing for us to have a dedicated government effort to look at edge science. And
Right.
existing scientific foundations, because this is just the way academia and bureaucracy works, tend to devalue the importance of studying edge science.
Yeah.
You don't get tenure if you're studying an edge science, right? You have to be pursuing the thing that academia has already agreed is important.
Yeah. Just as you say, and I think this will be true for both of us the rest of our lives, I'm not as up on all the things I want to read and study
Yeah.
as I ever will be.
Forever.
Years ago, I did dive deep into some of the scientific studies into things like precognition. And I know that Dr. Mossbridge has done some and found that some of the CIA experimentation with, I think it was remote viewing, but it might have
Remote
been
viewing, yeah.
a different form of precognition, because remote viewing could be very different, right?
Yeah.
That could not be a time
It might not, but
issue.
it's got some sort of spatial
right Yeah, then
dimension,
it's based
and you
on
can think of time as
space time. There you go.
Yeah.
So acknowledging that, that she reports that a couple of researchers looked at all of that data from those experiments and found a statistically significant effect
right.
related to the remote viewing or precognition, whatever it was. While acknowledging that, there have also been many, many other studies done that have shown no effect greater than
Right.
chance, or have shown that people who understand human psychology and perception well enough can easily manipulate people. Magicians, they do this all the time in terms of
Exactly.
creating the sense of precognition or remote viewing. And sometimes it's mentalist activity, which is thoroughly logical and explainable with the inputs of knowing your audience and all of that. My concern is, like in a lot of edge fields, you find a hit. And the hit in this case, the look at the CIA studies showed, yeah, there's some effect here. So you get the hit. And it's human nature to discount the 100 misses, right?
Right. Of course it
Just
is.
like
Yes.
Nostradamus, you can find some rhyme that Nostradamus had that really creepily does look like something that happened a few years later. And you forget the 990 other lines of absolute gibberish that have
Right.
tortured explanations to predict something, but don't. And so this is, I think, a real struggle. And I don't know how the scientific method combined with human psychology gets around this fundamental issue. Either you stick to replicable studies, and if you can't do it over and over again, then you can't say with certainty that it's there, or you just acknowledge, hey, some things that we want to explore, we're going to have a different standard to at least get started. I'm not sure where to come down on that.
Well, I mean, Julia would argue, and this is not my area of expertise, but Julia would make the argument that there have been replicable studies
Okay.
that have shown that there's something going on that is not explained by our current theories of cognition. That's what she would argue.
Yeah.
I think the people who are proponents of a lot of these ideas do in fact hurt their own cause by doing exactly what you described, by taking a spectacular hit
Yeah.
and running with it, taking it out of proportion, and not including the caveats. So, and given how bureaucracies are, I don't know how you prevent that from occurring.
Yeah. Well, we may not be able to prevent that from occurring, but we can be open to exploring edge issues, because issues that were once considered fantastical and beyond the edge, like quantum mechanics,
Right.
are mainstream, while at the same time acknowledging that over time, most of the things that were unexplainable and attributed to Zeus hurling thunderbolts are now
Right.
explained by very rational, scientific,
Right.
knowable things that don't involve
Right.
time loops and things of that sort. So keeping both of those firmly in mind, I think, is really hard, but it doesn't mean it's not worth trying.
So and so the thing is, where are you in that continuum? So
Mhm.
I agree. Many things that we thought were magic, we now know how they work. So is precognition one of those things? Is precognition something
Right.
that we clearly think is magic or a fraud,
Yeah.
but in 50 years we'll go, oh, now we know how that works?
Hmm.
If I were a betting person, I would bet that in 50 years, don't hold me to the increment, but with the passage of time,
Yeah.
we will learn that this is not magic, that this is in fact
Right. And then we
something,
expand.
this is a physical reality.
That's interesting because then it ends up being it is quantum mechanics in the same
It's just like
parallel,
quantum
right?
mechanics, it's just
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
else.
But in the same way that quantum mechanics created explanations for things, similarly, this would create an explanation that just
Right,
expands what is possible in our
right.
reality. Yeah.
I mean, all this talk about we're living in multiple or existence consists of multiple universes. I mean, I'm like befuddled by it all.
I'm befuddled by it all, but I'm open to research and explanations. And the
Exactly.
mathematicians say it's virtually certain based on some advanced math that I can't even understand the
Exactly.
Cliff Notes version of. But I think you're right, which is exploring it isn't a way of getting to the solution, well, it's outside science and it's just magic. It is a way of saying no, but now our understanding of what science includes is wider because we can
Right.
explain it. We just
Right.
have to change some of the assumptions the way that quantum
Right.
mechanics have.
Yeah.
But all of that, I think none of that on the exploration of precognition at its extreme invalidates anything we've said just about being more open to intuition in general, that insights can come in ways, whether, thoughts from the future or whether it's just really quick thinking that we can't comprehend.
Right.
But those insights are often more compelling than a well-reasoned legal brief.
Right. I think limiting our analytic process to rational methods
Hmm.
is flawed
Yeah.
and leads us to misunderstand like our own society, frankly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the election results indicate the limits of analytic thinking. Analytic thinking is just no longer persuasive
Yeah.
to apparently a significant portion of the American public.
So I'm going to put you on the spot again, Carmen. Are you going to write a book about this intuition or some other long essays? Because there's so many ideas here that I would love to see pulled together.
I feel like I'm just too old to write a
Because the
book.
book you have out, Rebels at Work,
Uh-huh,
which you
yeah.
co-wrote with Lois Kelly, was mind-opening in ways that there's only one other book that I thought of when reading it 10 years ago.
Yeah.
There was a book called Orbiting the Giant Hairball by Gordon
Yes.
MacKenzie,
Yeah,
which
that's
is a
right.
wonderful
Yeah.
little book about how to operate in a rules-based bureaucracy and still, get
Stay
creative
sane.
things done. And I think those two books pair really well together, but they're not really about these issues of intuition and analytic tradecraft and all of
Right.
that. And I just think the world needs more from you on this.
Well, thank you very much for saying that, but I don't know, it just takes a lot of energy to do these things well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I hope that comes to pass. In the meantime, we'll close our conversation by reaching into our
Okay.
chatterbox and pulling out a
I'm
question for
nervous.
you. Put you on the spot again. Carmen, what book or books are on your nightstand or on your Kindle or Audible list? But what are you taking in right now?
Okay, I can tell you that because
Mhm.
I do use a reading app.
Okay.
This will be a very odd one,
That makes it more interesting.
but I'm currently looking at How to Be a Renaissance Woman.
Oh,
By the author is Jill Burke, and it's the untold history of beauty and female creativity. And it talks about Renaissance Italy mostly,
Okay.
and how these concepts of beauty and expectations of women evolved. And I found that to be super interesting.
So it's not really a how-to book or a self-help
No, no,
book. It
no.
really is
It's
more of a
like
cultural history.
it's an intellectual history of the concept of feminine beauty.
Amazing.
I just finished reading 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed.
Yep.
Are you familiar with this book?
I am.
Yeah.
And I hesitated to pick it up because I wasn't convinced it would actually answer the questions. Then it would explore it, and I want the answers.
I don't know if this is a contemporary influence or not, but it talks a lot about climate change
Okay.
as a
Interesting.
causal factor.
Okay.
Both in this case, this is not climate change caused by humans. This is like Mother Nature.
Understood.
Climate change, like a volcano erupts,
Right.
and you have lots of earthquakes.
Boom.
Yeah, the last one I will recommend is I got two. I just finished reading The Infidel and the Professor by Dennis Rasmussen, which is a joint biography of David Hume and Adam Smith. Mm-hmm. They were fantastic friends during the Scottish Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And then the last one is The Ministry of Time.
Oh.
Have you heard of it?
Yes, I have. I think it's on my shelf. I haven't read it yet,
a
though.
story about time travel.
I'll give you one as payback. If you're interested in the concept of time travel, messages from the future, science fiction story called The Chronoliths.
The
Chronoliths. So like a combination of chrono for time and megalith or something. So chronolith, L-I-P-H.
Chronolith. Okay.
I want to say the author is Wilson.
Okay.
But I'll put that in the show notes as well. But that's another one that is an interesting take. I'm not completely convinced of the plot. I'm not completely convinced of the characters. But the conceit about how something from the future happens and creates a feeling of inevitability because it has happened. So therefore it has to happen when there's no indication of what's happening to get you there yet is an interesting exploration.
Yeah. No, I usually read nonfiction, but I will occasionally read compelling fiction.
Well, that fits our theme, right? Because the nonfiction, me wanting an answer for what happened in 1177 BC, or me wanting to understand how the concept of feminine beauty evolved in the Renaissance, that's track 2, that's type 2, that's me doing that. Fiction, music, art can be intellectual, but can also just be that feeling.
Well, I think music is just a fascinating thing, how it can have such resonant impact on you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Carmen, as expected, this has been fascinating and fun and informative. I'm regretting that it took me this long to do this, but I'm also very proud that you've agreed to be the bookend, if you will, for these chatter conversations. Thanks for spending so much time with me.
Thank you so much for reaching out, David. Take care.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.